Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zera Shimshon for this week, Parshat Terumah. We're going to continue with Megilat Esther. Next week, Bezrat Hashem will be back in live. This time, we're going to be due to some conflicts of my personal matters and also Ellie not being around. We're going to do it remotely to make it more convenient for everyone. So we're going to try to do two Torahs, and each one will be a separate recording. The first one is Megilat Esther, Torah Tet, which is one about that talks about the idea that Esther goes into the palace of Achashverosh, we know, into the chambers of Achashverosh towards the end, and she asks everyone to fast for her. And it says, and obviously we knew knew that it was fraught with danger, and it was very, she was very scared about doing it because she wasn't invited. So it says, Midrash al pasuk bayom hashishi vayisav Avram et Inav. So the question, the Midrash says that we know that Akedat Yitzchak, it says that Avraham on the third day, Avraham saw from afar, and that once he saw it there, he saw it from afar, and then the Midrash says, and that's what the same term is stated as it came to be on the third day that Esther wore for her royal garments. And both times, obviously, there's a Gezerat Shava or some sort of Hekesh, some sort of association between the two, because the same term is used. Be'ezah Zchut. So regarding the fact that Esther entered the chambers of Achashverosh on the third day, on account of which merit did she enter it? That's the question of the Midrash. Rabbanan Amrei B'Zchut Yom HaShlishi Shel Matan Torah Tichtiv Vayihi Bayom HaShlishi B'Yot HaBoker. Rabbi Levi Amar B'Zchuto Shel Yom HaShlishi Shel Avraham Dichtiv Bayom HaShlishi Vayisav Avram et Inav Ad Kan Loshano. So there's seemingly a machloket between the Rabbanin Amrei. The rabbis say that it's on the count of the day that what we learned in Parshat Yitro a couple of weeks ago. It says that on the third day, when it was morning, that's when, because of the zchut of that was what the merit, because they were instructed to prepare themselves. Bnei Yisrael were instructed to prepare themselves to receive the Torah, and was given on the third day of the social the third day of preparation. And the merit of this third day, on which the Torah was given, Esther was successful on the third day of the fasting and the approaching Achashverosh. Rabbi Levi says it's because of his Zchuto Shel Yom HaShlishi Shel Avraham. It was actually the merit of the third day that was mentioned above, which was Avraham Avinu. So it's seemingly a machloket. But the Midrash, the Zera Shimshon ends the quote and ends the quote from the Midrash over there. The question is, there is a difficulty that the Zera Shimshon points out with the Midrash in his typical fashion. He picks up a seemingly conflict or some sort of difficulty. He says, what's the reasoning of Rabbi Levi to even offer a different opinion with the Chachamim? Isn't the merit of receiving the Torah, meaning receiving the Torah at Har Sinai, was obviously much better and much stronger and much more impactful and much more momentous, right? Then we get the communal merit around Ma'amad Har Sinai, then it would be much more than Uvadai. It's obviously greater, more significant than the merit of Avraham, if we can actually say that the merit of Avraham was less, quote unquote, less valuable, less important, right? We obviously could say that the value of receiving the Torah en masse as a community, as a group of people, as an Am Yisrael, is greater and with worth has more merit than that of the individual. So he quotes the Yafei Torah. Rabbi Levi seems to say, according to the Yafei Torah, that preferred to derive the source of the merit from the third day of Avraham, because obviously it appears in the Torah before the third day of Matan Torah. So he says we'd rather give it. Rabbi Levi says rather I'd like to give it. So clearly, Rabbi Levi was just saying that since it's more appropriate to link the third day that is mentioned regarding Esther to the Akedah, to the first time it appears, as opposed to saying to the second, because that way it's really connecting the pasuk, the third day of Avraham, to the third day of Esther, as opposed to saying something in between, which is not chronologically correct. But this, the Zera Shimshon says, this is not enough of a. It's unsatisfactory. And why does he say that? And he's going to get to the answer now. And he says, an original interpretation of what Rabbi Levi's opinion is, which really introduced by pointing out difficulty with the words of the Chachami. So in order for what the Zera Shimshon is saying is, I have a question, I have a problem with what the Yefei Torah answers. But now I want to try to show you the other side of why I think the Chachamim's problem is also a statement is also problematic, and then try to give an answer. So he says, according to the Zera Shimshon, he says maybe Rabbi Levi is not actually coming to argue with the Chachamim, but only to resolve a difficulty that one might ask on the words of the Chachamim. If you look at the Psukim, right, the Chachamim said that Esther succeeded in receiving the merit of the third day that is mentioned at the giving of the Torah. But the problem is, what merit does this provide for the Jews? If we look at the pasuk that the Chachamim quote in the Midrash, it's only talking about on the third day there were lightning and there were signs and fire and brimstone and all these different things, but it wasn't really. But it was all from Hashem. It wasn't anything to do with the Jews. It wasn't any schut for the Jews, right? Unlike the pasuk by the Akedah, which speaks of Abraham's action, right? This verse speaks of Hashem's action. So could this be a source for the merit of the Jews, right? If the whole point of this midrash and the whole point of this idea is that the merit of the Jews on the third day of receiving the Torah is what inspired or kind of carried over into Esther. In other words, what he's saying is Rabbi Levi agrees that it would have been good if the pasuk would have said if that pasuk means the one that you should prepare yourself for 3 days, and that was a pasuk that the Chachamim said, then Rabbi Levi would obviously agree. But because they used a pasuk, right? They prepared themselves for 3 days. Then the connection between, or the correlation between the 3 days of Avraham, the third day that they were preparing themselves, and the 3 days that they prepared themselves at the time of Esther, that makes sense. That would imply that Esther says was due to the fact that the Am Yisrael, the community, prepared themselves to receive the Torah. Then Rabbi Levi would have considered it more powerful than the merit of the Akedah. So he says this pasuk that the Midrash doesn't bring anything beneficial or any merit to Bnei Israel, because they didn't do anything. It wasn't really there. It was really for Hashem. So the question is, what is the reasoning behind the Chachamim? So now, in order to make this, that's why Rabbi Levi comes. It's not that the Zera Shimshon is pointing out a small little fine-tuned thing here. He's saying is the Chachamim and Rabbi Levi don't disagree, and that's why I said originally they seemingly disagree. Here, the saying is that in merit of the third day that is mentioned by Avraham, Kolomar, Lama Zachu Yisrael Shekadma Shechina Lavol B'yot Ama Boker Shalem Hashashi. Why did the Jews? So he says this is a beautiful thing of the Zera Shimshon. He says the merit of the third day mentioned Avraham. That's what Rabbi Levi says. He says that why did the Jews merit that the Shechina would come early at the time of the Ma'amad Har Sinai on the third day when it was morning? So he says it's actually all connected. So he says is that what happened when the time of Avraham Avinu at the time of Akedah wakes up early, and because he woke up early and he was so Zariz and was so fast and excited to do the mitzvot, to perform the mitzvot, that his excitement and his alacrity was so impactful that it impacted when Hashem would reside during Ma'amad Har Sinai, and that excitement of them and seeing all that greatness and that excitement moved on next to the time of Esther. So that's what he says. Right? So he's saying is now the midrash is resolved. There's no machloket between Rav Levi and Chachamim. Rabbi Levi ba'lefaresh livrahim. Rabbi Levi comes to explain the words of Chachamim. Vein hachinami she'zchut yom hashishis matan Torah garam le'Esther shetimsachi beinei hamelech. Indeed, it is correct that the merit of the third day from Ma'amad Har Sinai impacted on the third day, which was of the time and find favor for Esther to find favor in the eyes of Achashverosh. However, the merit of the giving of the Torah early was because of the Avraham with the time of the Akedah. So by saying the third day when it was morning describes the action of Hashem as giving the Torah without mentioning any merit of the Jews, the Chachamim indicated that although the direct merit through which Esther succeeded was that of the giving of the Torah, that merit was itself due to Avraham. So we have this like a nice cycle of all three things. So Rabbi Levi explains that this is the merit of Avraham at the Akedah. So because Avraham acted with such alacrity and rose early and got early to obey Hashem's mitzvot, his descendants merited that Hashem would wait for them at Har Sinai, but as it says at the Ma'amad Har Sinai, that's the second one. That's the Ma'amad Har Sinai. That's why it says Hashem's presence came down, and not Bnei Israel that they were waiting for 3 days, or that they had to wait for 3 days for Kedusha. Right now we understand the connection between Vayashkem Avram Boker, and it says, and by embracing this opportunity, the Jews merited that Esther's were able to find favor in the eyes of Achashverosh. Now it says, Rabbi Levi. Now we can understand, we look at the words of Rabbi Levi. If we look at the words, and this is where the Zera Shimshon again highlights his beautiful understanding of Midrashim and attention to detail. He says, we look at the words of Rabbi Levi, he didn't say in the merit of the third day that is mentioned by Avraham, in the same manner that is the Chachamim say in the merit of the third day that is mentioned by Ma'amad Har Sinai. Elashani b'dibure. Rather, he changed the wording. V'amar b'zchuto shel yom hashlishi shel Avraham. Right? He says, instead of saying b'zchut yom hashlishi shel Avraham, he says b'zchuto shel yom hashlishi shel. What's the reason? In the context, you might say there's not much of a reason, but the very fact that Rabbi Levi veered and changed offers a highlight of the Zera Shimshon's explanation. We may explain that this wording implies that Rabbi Levi is not addressing the original question regarding which merit Esther had when she entered the Achashverosh's room, but rather introducing a new point. That is what he was explaining the Chachamim's words and saying that the third day that is mentioned by the Ma'amad Har Sinai is the outcome of another third day, Shel Avraham. Indeed, we learned the entire concept of serving Hashem with alacrity and with zrizut and with excitement from Avraham Avinu, and that's actually in the Gemara in Pesachim Daf Daled Amud Aleph. We learn the whole idea of zrizut and excitement for serving Torah, serving Hashem with from Avraham Avinu, and then every other time that we see zrizut mentioned, actually, in fact, I believe in next week's Parsha in Tetzaveh. We actually see some part of that as well. But in either which way, his descendants, since Avraham was so quick to serve Hashem, his descendants were merited to receive the Torah, and thus, even although the direct merit through which Esther succeeded in her mission was because the Jews had accepted the Torah, the Akedah becomes an indirect or kind of like a grandparent or the ultimate source, right? The original source of the idea of the inherited source, or if you will, that's the original one, and then Ma'amad Har Sinai is the second one, and the second one leads to the third one. So all the levels of his rizut, you can see something very impactful here and important is the value of his rizut and how its impact on not only us but on future generations.